record on the computer. Okay, you've heard that. And so now I am going to mute all of you and be very, very careful if you would, folks, because again, I'm still in here on participants trying to find that on the mute. Okay, mute all. There they go. It's muted for everybody that I can see. And hopefully as people come in, we do that. Because if you're talking in the background, folks, sometimes that'll come through. And then Cheryl has to do miracle things to cut things out of our presentations. And I'm so appreciative of what she does. Today we have an interesting topic, at least for me, on homestead types. First of all, everything that I'm talking to you about today with homestead types, each one of these require anywhere from a 20 to a 50-minute presentation on their own if you're going to go into some more depth. I'm not the only presenter on these. Certainly you can find things out online as you need them. But the news is there was not just one way to get land in the American colonies or in the United States. And there were many kinds of legislation. The last homesteads, I believe, were in about the 60s, even up in Alaska. So they went on that long from at least the official Abe Lincoln designation of a homestead early entry in 1862. So I'm going to show you on the share screen today just a couple of things, and then we'll go into the presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to hopefully be able to show you what the Glow Records site looks like and what you can be looking for just some of these things. So first of all, you got some handouts today, and I'm not going to go into those, especially other than to show you what I call the pre-information site, the pre-1908 information site that is needed to get to some material, because here's the news, not everything is at the Bureau of Land Management site. So there's that pre-information material. I want to go back again and just show you the beginnings of this presentation, and we will get started from the beginning, hopefully. And hopefully it's there if I can get rid of this on the screen. Hopefully you're just seeing the screen. So homestead types, an introduction for you. I was fascinated by homestead types 18 years ago when I first found the Government Land Office record site out on the internet. I was so pleased. I went out in one evening and I found over 40 of my relatives, all of us very poor, of course, who had applied and evidently been successful with their homesteads. But then there was Aunt Marge, and she told me, oh no, there were two other brothers who had been out there homesteading, and I had not found their sites and I had not found them on the site. And she said, I wonder why. So did I, but I just figured maybe they didn't have everything up at a particular site yet. Oh, and did I say that when I first got started, I thought that it was lovely that the Government Land Office site out at BLM gave me a one-pager telling me that my great-grandfather and my grandfather had gotten their homesteads, and it was a nice one-piece sheet. Boy, I did not realize all of the other information that was available about them. So I realized once I got to looking at some pictures that I needed to know more than a picture like this one could tell me. I mean, this picture can tell us a lot in terms of looking at, by the way, that's an oversized first building on a homestead. It indicates that it's been built on, because most of them were 10 by 10, 10 feet by 10 feet. You at least had to have that to get started with one of those homesteads. Yes, there were specifications. We can see quite a bit here. And my brother would say, look at that bleak background. Well, here's some things I knew about my granddad Beck's homestead. Only no one told me most of what I'd learned was not true. This is the cabin that I came home to in May 1946 when I was born. My folks were living in my granddad's cabin with 5 children and grandpa and them all living in this very, very small 20 by 25 building because our house had caught on fire in Ferndale and had burned down. I always thought this was the homestead. But in fact, it wasn't the homestead. When I went to look for my Grandpa Beck's homestead, I discovered that he had homesteaded 45 years before this over in North Dakota. And he'd had that for 24 years before he lost it to taxes in the Depression. So what was this place? Well, this place is in Ferndale, Montana, 4 miles from Big Fork. And it is my grandpa's cabin. It looks a little different today. It's still logged, though. But this was what my grandpa actually bought. So when I found the story about that, I was told that it was 2.5 acres plus the cabin for $600. The family story was a little twisted. Actually, when I found the land records just last summer in Kalispell, I discovered that Grandpa indeed did purchase this. This was not his original homestead. He purchased 2 acres of land for $420. The most exciting thing for me when I looked at the land was to find out, yes, it was part of the original 160-acre homestead for the Moose family. They were the first ones in Ferndale. And no, that's not a moose animal. That's moose, M-O-O-S. So stories get told, and sometimes we have to go after better information, and we have to know a little more so that we're getting the best information. Today, my goal is to introduce you to some homestead types, to introduce you to the homestead era in the West after 1862, when Abe Lincoln, in the midst of the Civil War, generated that homestead language for Western states. I want to alert you most of all to the limitations of various things so your search can be successful. So you may even know why your search is not successful, and you'll know where to go next. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to the Bureau of Land Management site there and talk about the features and the limitations there, so you don't think that everything is out there at glowrecords.blm.gov. So that's quite a bit in the next 45 minutes. So let's get started. This is typical of the ads that were published in newspapers not long after the Civil War was over in 1865, advertising that there were farms of fertile prairie, to be had free of cost. This was Central Dakota before we had North Dakota and South Dakota, 30 millions of acres. And the Chicago and Northwestern train wanted you on that train, and they said you needed a farm, and they explained how to get there on their train, using some of their cars to get your animals there and your household goods there. This was a very, very typical kind of ad for that homesteading era. By the way, ads like this went out, homesteads like this went out in the United States and went out across the world. You can see actually a German translation of this for the areas in Germany. You can see one for Norway. You can see one for Sweden. So these ads were translated because they knew it was important to get people there, and they knew it was important to get their immigrants there. They had to get them beyond those big cities in New York and Baltimore and down in New Orleans, all of the various places that immigrants were coming in, and they had to get them to the land because they needed settlers. Well, here's what to look for and where to find it. As you perhaps have guessed by now, or even before this, the type of the homestead or various kinds of land awards prior to 1862 are based on the history of the times, what the U.S. government wanted to do, what kind of legislation had been introduced by Congress to try to get people to settle. And then, of course, some states actually also awarded land depending on military awards given or awards given in places where they were afraid that there would be very few homesteaders. NARA stands for the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Most all of these are files, and they're going to be by type and by time period. And so it's very important for you to know that and to look for those things that way. It's also really important for you to know that before 1908, files are not indexed by name. They may be found by description. And sometimes you can get limited information from your county office. Those are lots of limitation, folks. Let me tell you that there are 3 states, Montana and Nebraska and Oklahoma, where still not everything has been indexed by name because of the ways in which states began to share Indian reservation lands, for example, and other lands. And so you may still need more information to get to the real nitty-gritty on the homestead you are looking for. One of the first things I would advise you to do is to go out for some really good general information out at Wikipedia on homestead acts. It's a 7-page paper. When you run it off, it's worth running it off and looking at it in the first place because it will give you some general information. I had no idea that my grandpa Lee had another homestead beyond his original homestead entry. I had no idea that he had this thing called a stock raising grant of land. Why did he get that? Well, I found out actually that he got it in lieu of the land that wasn't too good in his original homestead entry. My great-great-grandfather, Coglizer, looked at an ad just like this, Lands for the Landless. He and his family had been living in Ohio, where he was a blacksmith and had never owned land. He'd been in the Civil War, though, for the entire time of the Civil War. And notice this ad says, soldiers of the War of 1861, come forward and take your homesteads near some railroad in Nebraska. Well, my great-great-grandpa Coglizer did just that. He had been in the war for 4 years. There was a 5-year time on a homestead for Nebraska. He went out to Johnson County, filed for the homestead, and all of the time that he had actually participated in the Civil War counted against that. So he took final possession of his particular land in 1 year in Johnson County, promptly sold that and went next door to be with his brother in Cass County. But yes, you could do that. That, by the way, was the last time that I know of anyway, where soldiers got land because they had fought in some war. Prior to the Civil War, you'll see in a few minutes, there were kinds of land given, and they were military bounty lands. And they're way too much for today. We'll just mention them. Well, military bounty land warrants were there from post-colonial days, right at the beginning of our country. People were given military bound land warrants for so many days of being a soldier or whatever in the Revolutionary War, in the Mexican War, various kinds of things. But that had largely stopped by legislation prior to the Civil War. So that little add-on from Nebraska was a pretty neat deal for people who wanted to come out there. We've always had preemptions. That is, people just went and squatted. We'll talk about those. we have these things that are very important for you called original homestead entries. That's exactly how they will be described by legislative authorization date beginning 1862. Many of those in the West are that. And I can tell you, if you get into one of these, you get a gold mine. The smallest one that I've seen is 17 pages. And the largest one, Cheryl Lucas, I know I did one for her that was over 100 pages. And you can get those from NARA. And we'll talk about that near the end of this presentation. There are things called Desert Land Act homestead claims by certain authorization and year. And there are Timber Culture Act claims by authorization and year. There's this thing called homestead entry stock raising for when the land wasn't too kind to you that you got originally. That also being the same case, by the way, for the desert land. If you were to get desert land claim and timber culture claim, you had to do certain things. For timber culture, you had to actually plant some trees. And then, of course, there's individual state legislation. And we may think that BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, was the only one who had land programs, but that's not true. Prior to about 1906, 1907, the U.S. Forest Service was called the U.S. Forest Reserve, and they also had a land program that stopped about that time, and rights were given over to the BLM. So you need to be aware of that type too. Military bounty land files, just briefly, because they require a whole topic of their own, and it's usually about an hour and a half to 2 hours. They were given for military bounty land files for the Revolutionary War Service, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, any of the indigenous or Indian wars and removal of tribes, and more. Sometimes state gave lands to what we would call National Guardsmen. That's all very individual legislation, and you need to look at it very carefully with your state. Those early ones, the Revolutionary War, for example, and the War of 1812, the Mexican War, could be used in areas of land designated as a military district. That is, for military bounty land, like early Ohio, like the lands that were actually over in what we know of as today as Kentucky, but it was Virginia early on. So that's what it looked like. They require the year of the Congressional Act authorizing the warrant, the acreage, and the warrant number. They're not too hard to find, but they're not under the aegis of easy fruit either. You will have to do some searching if you suspect these. Why would you suspect that you might have one of these? Well, you're going to find your people in things like all of those soldiers from New York and Massachusetts and Maine and Maryland and so on who served in the Revolutionary War. Or you might find the same thing for those people who registered and were officially in war mode for 1812 or the Mexican War. These are going to be found by what we call the tract book. And we'll talk about those tract books a little later. So this is really a topic for another time. The National Archive and the Bureau of Land Management locates most all of their entries simply by two things. Entries pre-1908, meaning they're a little harder to find and they require more research and more information in the first place. And then the entries after 1908, when we had a huge homesteading era, are a lot easier to find, at least the initial paperwork. Then you have to go to the site, hopefully for you online at NARA, and apply for that by its number. Wait for them to run off all the pages. I advise that you actually have them copied, not just put on a thumb drive. Sometimes the copies are not too good on those thumb drives, and you won't find out about it until you get it. Generally, if they are making copies, they're aware that they need to make a good copy for you. And they are a little easier to find. You will not be billed by NARA until you get that. But the price right now, at least I believe, is $50. Hopefully it hasn't gone to $75 yet. For the pre-1908 land files, I've provided you with a handout today that I told you about in the initial announcement. It's called the 7-State Index. Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Florida, Louisiana, Nevada, and Utah have been indexed pretty fully for everything pre-1908. And it's so important because this is the only way in those states that you're going to find out not only the people who succeeded and got the land, that is, they went through the entire process, but you're also going to find out who didn't make it, who relinquished their land, or their land was canceled or taken for them for some reason. And that involves approximately, when you look at all homesteaders throughout all time, that's about 48 to 50% of all homesteaders. So you want that information. You might be finding valuable information about ancestors who applied, but then didn't get through the process. Susan Connell, who is one of our members here in Great Falls, has done a great job for Cascade County by putting together a 39-page paper delineating a lot of the people for Cascade County, because of course, Montana's not in this 7-State Index. A lot of Montana's stuff is just out there. And some of it is gradually being scanned, and some of it is gradually being indexed by fine people like Susan Connell, and we thank her very much. So the 7-State file for those pre-1908 files shows the entry person's name, the state where they claimed it, the type of entry. Remember, there's lots of those, the certificate number or the file number, the legal land description, which is so important because if you have that legal land description, I can show you how and where to map that land, even if you're not sure of who precisely got the land. And then bonus, it contains those successful entries and the unpatented or relinquished entries. So that's a very important thing. You have that list all on one page in the original invitation for today. But the other 23 states, including Montana, Nebraska, Oklahoma, for example, and more, you have to have some information. The person's name, I recommend here that you go with a first and a last. Ignore the middle name unless you're sure that person always used that middle name. You'll be taking yourself out of the asking if you don't do that, because you just want to ask by the simplest entry possible. If you think you know the state where it was claimed and the type of entry, then you're still not there until you get to the correct land office. Now, let me tell you a neat way to find that today without having to go look in all 23 states. If you're lucky, your person's land may have been advertised in the newspaper no matter what when they first started. And the correct land office will be cited in that ad. So you're going to be able to find it by looking out at something like genealogybank.com or newspapers.com or newspaper archives, some of those places. It's not easy to find those maybe, but it's a possibility. You're also going to be able to find this information, however, in the Government Land Office tract books. And the site we're going to look at today will at least give you some ideas about where those tract books are and what their status happens to be. You're going to be able to find it at glowrecords.blm.gov. Please, people, don't abandon me right now while you go make that look. I do understand. Your application numbers are really important, so get to them. You need to be really familiar with this BLM site so you know what's behind every screen. Take time to go through everything, because the Homestead Act of 1862, the Timber Culture Acts, there was more than one, the Desert Land Entry Acts, you have to have that application number because it's the final filing number. And if you want to know that something got canceled or relinquished, that's the only way you're going to find that. Or a cash entry, which, by the way, I advise not sending for cash entries. They are a single page. They will not be even something that says that it has been purchased. They just give the price. Here's what the Glow Records site doesn't have. It doesn't have an index to all of those pre-1908 records. Montana, Oklahoma, and Nebraska are excluded for those relinquishments and those cancellations and things that happened with land. It does have an index to cancellations and relinquishments for those states pre-1908, but probably not all of them. I'm just going to caution you and say that you still might not find all of those. For example, it's not even been mentioned at their site, but the state of Idaho genealogy societies years and years and years ago went to the state, found all of their cancellations, and they published, I believe it's 5 small books. I know we have these in our library. And if you're down in Salt Lake City or someplace where you know those books are located in a library, you can look in there for the Idaho cancellations and relinquishments. That highlights the idea that maybe other places did this too. Even if it was only a county, like what we've just recently done, or it's only part of a state or whatever. So be on the lookout for those. This also has an index for land records pre-1820, the bounty lands, but again, it's a little sketchy, so watch it. Tract books are very important for you. They're large bound volumes. You'll find them. The most complete tract books are in Washington, D.C. at NARA. So you may have to hire, if you're not going there, you may have to hire a researcher. They document all the general and the bounty land warrant land entries before and after 1908, because we didn't just start giving land away in 1862. We had tried lots of different schemes and not all of them worked. So again, I'm telling you, these tract books document those. They provide information elements you need to identify them, especially those prior to 1908, and a local land office like the one we have in Billings or at a county level or whatever may have a tract book. Ask them if it's the complete information, because the tract books, so far as I know, the most complete ones are in Washington, D.C., at NARA. They contain just all kinds of things, like who had the right-of-way on various things to get into those lands. What were the forest reserve lands that could be given, and who gave them and who got them? What were the Indian reservation lands, and how were those divvied up when the states decided that they were going to take back some of those lands, or take them in the first place, not just back, but just take them. And then state lands that were given to people. It's going to greatly help you with pre-1908 entries for at least 3 states and probably a bunch more. What I'm cautioning you about is, do not assume that because your person is not listed at a BLM site or within a military bounty record book for Kentucky or some other state, do not assume that they didn't have it. Not all the work has been done yet. They are, again, the U.S. Archive tract books are the best because they have the cadastral survey information, land description, and they have the maps for the particular state. And the maps are just the very best. Some of our regional archives, like those out in Seattle or down in Denver, may have some of the information. Sometimes they do have a pretty complete tract book, and they may not have all of those special case pieces of information. And the reason that a tract book is so important is when all of this land was surveyed, the state and county civil divisions probably didn't even exist, or the townships didn't exist that are so important when you're looking at those large sections of land. So they weren't used at all by the surveyors or by Glow Records in describing these things. Now, when you go out to the Glow Records site today, you're going to see that over on the far right edge of a particular entry, you are going to see a county that is described. Another caution is in place. This is the current county this is not the county necessarily that land was gotten under. You'll still need to go back and look at other information. Those ads, advertising that you have gotten land from some particular place, like a land office, are best for you if you don't have tract information. They're arranged by legal description with the numbered section, the township, the range. They might include the land entry type. Not all of them do. The application date. I'm going to tell you something. You have to be very careful of that application date. I've had people say, I don't understand this. My family didn't come out to Montana until 1904. I know they got land, but it says they got the land in 1862. No, they didn't. That is the authorizing legislation date. Frequently, you'll see it in there. It says original homestead entry, and then it'll give the date in 1862. So the application date and the actual time when a homestead was finally settled, that's something that you may finally have to go to the county for to see when somebody finally brought that land in to be registered with the county clerk and recorder. It might have the acreage, and it might have the cost or not. And it might have the final certificate or warrant. What can you do first? I want you to become familiar with the Glow Records BLM government site. Go out and have a blast with this place, see what it contains, put in names in various ways and so on, explore. Make sure you use the mapping feature that I'm going to show you. And from your notes today, be cautious. Know what it won't contain. You know, you can look forever at that site, but if it was not delineated at that site, or that particular site does not do that particular piece of information, you are not going to find that information. Use the index there. If you can, find the file information that is needed or decide where to go next. It's very, very interesting. I want to also tell you another neat place where you can find information maybe about a homestead. A lot of the books that were put together in 1964 and 1976 for particular counties for their histories. Out here in Montana, I've seen some in Wyoming also, and some in North Dakota and South Dakota. A lot of places actually took the time to set up section maps showing the township and the section maps for particular things, and most important, who they were pretty sure was recorded on that land as the first settler. Now, one of the ones that I'm familiar with, particularly in this area of Montana, I'm going to tell you that the people who did the Big Sandy book did a particularly fine job of describing their homesteads, the townships, the et cetera. And so it's another way for you to begin to get that information. Their book, I have, if you're interested in that area, I have re-indexed that book, and I believe my index of that book is out at our Great Falls genealogy site online. You can go look for the Big Sandy book, and within it, it will tell you who the person was who got the land and whether it was original homestead entry or whatever, and give you those pages so that you can take a look at that. Be aware, however, that sometimes information can be wrong. So you always want to go to the original entry, the best information you can find to settle your agreements and your problems with a particular homestead. Know what is possible and then go get the very best you can. Your land entry case file request when you're contacting NARA has to include information elements. Pre-July, you would have to use that 7-state file or the NARA tract books, or hopefully find that pre-July 1908 file out at the Glow record. Remember, everything post-July 1908, when Montana had a huge homesteading time, as did South Dakota, as did North Dakota, Washington, a few other places. The general land entries require the name of the entry man or woman, let me say that here, and the serial patent number. And the bounty land warrants, again, require the year of the congressional act. So, and probably looking a little more closely at bounty land warrants. This is my grandpa, Oscar L. Eskew. I was so pleased to find his land. He got his land at the Havre Land Office. And note that the United States had reserved the mineral reservations and said, no, you can't have those. But this is a homestead entry original, with the authority being May 20, 1862, the 12th Congress statute, etc. And under general remarks, it says additional GLO serial. There's another number there. I didn't pay too much attention to that when I first saw this. I was just happy. First of all, I'd found my grandpa Oscar, although I knew him as Oscar L. Lee, because that's what he changed his name to in 1912. I knew that after reading for just a couple of seconds out at the site, that I knew I needed the document number and the BLM serial number, and you'll notice those down there in that left-hand corner, and that he got a total of 320 acres, 320 and 3/4 of an acre. And I thought that was kind of weird at the time, but okay. But when I actually went to Washington, D.C., because that was fun for me, I went to Washington, D.C. and actually went to NARA and got over 40 of the homestead papers for my family. Yes, we were very poor, so they were all very interested in land that came free if you sat on it for either 3 or 5 years. Well, when I went back there and I looked at Oscar L. Eskew, because that's the file I asked for, they brought me a very nice, secure gray box that was keeping good care of the documents within, because remember, these are original documents. When I looked inside, there were 2 applications. There was one under Oscar L. Eskew, and then my gramps took great care to apply or to transfer his information to Oscar L. Lee. So I got a bonus because it came in underneath his new land. And oh, by the way, that extra information that was in there all in one site, that was his stock raising thing that he got. He got additional land beyond his 160. That's what was the difference between 320 acres and 160 acres. He got stock raising land because he complained and explained in a letter to them at the end of the first year that he was homesteading that he had not been able to plow up all the land they required because it was all hilly. He could not do it. It was pretty, and he had people who spoke for him and said, yes, that is true. So when you look at these, make sure you're asking for all of the information. If I'd been back home, I hope I would have gotten everything from this file, but I'm not sure. Maybe they would have only given me the information for Oscar L. Eskew. By the way, some people just said, let's cut right to the chase, and there's land out here. I've got some money. I just want to buy this. So how much are you going to charge me? Well, it was anywhere from $1.75 an acre on up, depending on where it was. Again, if you're getting the homestead from back east at NARA, it won't even be necessarily a bill of sale. It'll just be the cash amount scribbled on a piece of paper, because that actually took place. That particular thing took place right at the local land office. For example, the Billings land office or the Havre land office or whatever, wherever it was in a particular state. So any of the after 1908 cash entries may just have the type of land entry, like, I bought an extra 40 acres and the cash amount paid and nothing else. My advice, take your time, go to the county courthouse and consult the record there to see when the land got registered, because no matter what, remember, all of these homesteads, when they are finally proved up, have to be registered in the county with the county clerk and recorder. and consult the record there to see what that originally was and what else came in. That's a great way to be able to get a little more information about a cash entry. Again, I'm going to caution you, pre-1908, you need to know the times as they could have been labeled pre-41, indicating a long ago preemption act of 1841 where people paid cash for the land they had squatted on. Squatters, well, that's another workshop topic. It means dollars. Out in Montana, by the way, when you're looking, I'll use Montana as the example because, of course, we became territory in 1864, and the ability was there for you to do some type of homesteading. And frequently, people squatted on the land they wanted, had to not necessarily go through the typical kind of prove-up exercise that I've shown you. They paid cash. Oh, by the way, the other thing they did have to prove, however, is that they were an American citizen. So sometimes in this paperwork, by the way, if you've got an immigrant who has applied for homesteads, you will find, wow, wonderful things in there. You will find their naturalization papers, or at least a reference to the fact that they have been naturalized and when and where that occurred. I'm telling you, all of the papers that are available in these things are just gold. Preemption entries were squatter right entries for different homestead eras. They're labeled preemption usually, and then you'll know that land had been settled on first, and they could be purchased by claiming a preemption right. You still had to do it by recording that you were claiming that preemption, and you still had to register it, and you still had to pay it. There isn't anything of, well, I squatted on that land and you can come and take it from me if you want to, but I'm not doing any kind of registration. No, they are all registered. Again, those cadastral elements are really important, and the maps are just as important. Sometimes you can find those cadastral maps at the state level. In Montana right now, unfortunately, at our Montana Historical Society, it's closed for 2 years. So we're kind of hanging on that until, I believe, 2024, 2025, when they open the new museum. But cadastral elements, sometimes you can find those, and a few more of them are being mapped all the time. But just know there are hundreds, not just dozens, there are hundreds of these. And so when you're looking for that cadastral map, you may have to get some information from NARA. And that really, if we're talking about cadastral elements and the surveys that are done and the way in which those surveys are done and what that looks like for each state separately, that's a workshop in and of itself. You may be aware of what townships are, that they are 36 square miles, that a section is 640 acres, and it might be anything right down to that small part that my grandpa Beck got for 2 acres out of the original 160 that someone else had applied to. So it's important that you begin to understand all of the section describers, and those are readily available out online. There are books about them. It requires a little bit of familiarity so you can get used to these, especially when you're looking at those homestead maps that you'll see in local county histories, or even the homestead maps that we have here in our particular library in Great Falls, because they're all designated using the public land survey system, everything. Public domain surveys and townships, as each territory or state came within the public domain, meaning they were owned by the state, the government land office established a baseline and a prime meridian north and south. These are all different for each state, so be very, very careful. And the numbered townships were laid out. The intersecting lines formed a checkerboard or grid of townships. Each had 36 sections, 640 acres for a section, and a square mile in area. So knowing some of this information and what you're looking at is very, very important. You can find excellent information at the National Archive and at the Government Land Office and out online. I've already told you about the wiki site. It does a great job in 7 pages. Here's another one that I've used before because it just has great information. Out at the Government Land Office record site, you can search for this particular paper, Research in the Land Entry Files of the General Land Office, compiled by Kenneth Hawkins some time ago and revised again in 2009. And it does a nice job again of giving you the flavor and the background and what's going on in general with each kind of homestead. I'm going to ask you to go out this week and try using the Glow Records site. It's a free site, but remember, it only contains certain information. So learn to use their index, learn to use all the ancillary informational links that they have there. Go out and look at them. They also have the legal terminology site there. It's not totally complete, but it'll give you a pretty good way for you to begin to look at things. Use the mapping feature and use the land descriptor to find the place when you don't have a particular name. What's really kind of fun with this site is you don't have to have the name for a person. You could just go look at that site and say, who has that land now? Or what did that land look like? I know it's out here someplace by Belt, Montana, or down by Bozeman. But if I put in these site descriptors that my uncle originally had or my great grandpa had, can I see the original land site generally? Yes, you can, and you can drill down to it. So let's go out there for a brief demonstration. Hopefully it's been holding for me. If it hasn't, then we'll have to go to plan B, which is having you do it on your own after the presentation is done. But I'm going to go out right now and stop sharing this particular thing, and hopefully go out again to the share screen and see if it will let me in to this site. And if it's up, it looks like it's still up. So we're out, I hope, live on this site. And I want to acquaint you just with a few features. This is what it looks like when you come up. Notice at the top, it says glowrecords.blm.gov/search/default, etc. This is all you have to be able to go out to it. You're going to be able to search across the United States, but you should know there are different kinds of homesteads and different ways in which land were given. And so this doesn't control everything. I'm going to show you by looking at this state map today. I'm going to go out to Montana. When you look at county, you can look at any county you want to. If I put in Hill, hopefully my grandpa's will come up, but I do know that when he got this, he actually got it under Choteau County. I'm going to look at that last name of Eskew, and it doesn't have to be capitalized or anything. And I'm going to see if I can pull him up. If I can't, we'll pull up someone else. Notice that down here, when I pull it down a little, at the bottom, it says you can just have the land descriptor. That's all you'd need. If I had his land descriptor, I could plunk in all, at least 2 to 3 of those, at least the township in the range, and probably the land would come up and then I could look at it. Note that over to the right, it gives you some simple directions for being able to search for a land patent. I've searched for the state. I've put the county in. It says they want at least one additional thing, the name of the person, and then click the search patents button, which is down here in kind of the rust color near the bottom. So I'm going to do that now. And it's going to bring up this, which is good. It's my grandpa. And notice it shows that he's gotten 2 different kinds of things. Those dates, 9/11, 1914, don't really mean anything. They are the site. They're probably the time when he finally went in and registered his land. By the way, I've seen people finally get these registered 25 years later. So that's why I'm saying don't think that that date is significant, at least till you go look at the land itself and who got it next or when it was registered. And you do that by going to the county clerk and recorder. So that next thing will tell you some things. The land office was at Havre. They reserved mineral rights. He's got a homestead entry original When I got this paper, it was about 30 pages. His total acreage was 320 acres. And I can tell you, I was just so tickled because probably the most fun thing in there was my grandpa's own home drawn 5x7 little map of what he'd done. His little cabin, his barn, his hen house, the particular corral that he had, everything that was on that land. That was the most fun for me, was seeing that original drawing that he had put in there. So total acreage, that was a pretty cool thing. Well, now I want you to notice that I'm pointing up here in the right-hand corner at the printer-friendly area, because in order to be able to get this, you need to have the land patent details. And this is a sheet that you want to run off. It tells you that it's a serial patent from Montana, was not canceled. It's from Oscar L. Eskew. It gives you the land information, et cetera. It gives you, however, the document numbers, and they are very, very important down here. And that lets you know that, for one thing, the coal was reserved to the United States, anything that happened to be on that land, because they knew there was probably coal on that land. It's pretty common. It was a very poor type of coal, but it was reserved. By the way, did homesteaders use it anyway? Yeah, but they didn't open official coal mines on that land. So that's what you need to know. You're going to need to know the document number and the BLM serial number so that you can fill that in out at the NARA site. Or if you want to get the official paperwork out there, you can do that and send it in snail mail. I advise, however, if you can, actually doing this by going out to the NARA site and looking for homesteading information underneath the genealogy area. It's very easy to find. Going in and seeing what the paperwork is that's needed, or going to the site that allows you to just apply for it online. So you need this information. Now let me show you another fun part. I'm going down to this screen and it says, here's the land description, and you've got this faint map of the United States. This is my grandpa's land, however, over here in Hill County. So now, when I began putting the check marks in, voila, what appears? But in general, the area along Bullhook Creek up by Havre that my grandpa settled on. And you'll notice there are parts and parcels and so on. Well, guess what I can do? I can keep clicking on this and bringing it closer if I want to. And if I were my grandpa and I were being allowed to show this on a map for people, I'd be saying, see, I told you that this land had lots of hills on it, because you can just faintly see all of those marks that show that the land was quite hilly in most of the original portion over here that he got, where I'm running my little blippy around. So you can do this. You can run and get the information for this. You can go back and remove this information and go back to someone else's homestead if you want. You can do various things at this site. Mapping with this is a very important thing, however, and it can provide you with lots of information. A couple of other things before we go away from this site. There's, of course, the search documents, which I took you into in the first place. There's next to it, to the right, the reference section, and it gives you all kinds of information about their documents and their search tips and so on, and what you do in the case of Eastern States patents and what you do in the case of West and so on. It gives you appendices and glossaries and the FAQs, the frequently asked questions. Well, they're just the questions you would have asked anyway, so they sure are worth looking at. You can go out and look at their survey manuals, and in general, you can get probably as deep as you want to, or when you're still not deep enough, it's going to refer you to another place in the GLO site, the Government Land Office site. So it really is a pretty neat thing. There's a support site where you're saying, I'm having problems technically the record system. I will tell you, I really wanted to do this last weekend. I wanted to work with this. I'll tell you, at times, this site is down because it's been at the U.S. military site for a long time. And sometimes when they require usage, you'll just find that it is unaccountably down. It will tell you how long it's down. This last weekend, they were down for a planned outage for about 70 hours, but it said that it was there and it came on again right away when it said it would. The Pathfinder site, you can look at land descriptions, documentation on usage. This is a little more in depth probably from the Department of the Interior than you might want to go, but gee, there's lots of things here for you to look at and things to do. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope that you will go out and look at this, and then generally a little later on, I will be doing some hour-and-a-half workshops on types of homesteads and going into the information a little more and showing you what happens when something gets challenged by someone else, because a lot of these got challenged, especially after, you know, a cabin was built, the barn was built, the hen house was built, and somebody comes along and says, but you didn't spend all your time there, and I can prove it, and I want the land. Or in the case of my husband's great-grandmother, she got 160 acres down by Harlowton. The land office made an itty-bitty mistake, or nope, it was giant. And her land had a house on it, small, but it had a barn on it. It had a corral and a few other things. And someone said, this isn't right. This land wasn't even eligible to be homesteaded on. It's the government land office right, but I'm a big time rancher and I want this land. It's right in the center of my stuff. Well, she did get the land, and her heirs got the land later on because the government land office had made a mistake. She was a gutsy woman. She applied through her congressional office in Montana all the way back to the congressional offices, and she finally got a homestead that is signed by the president and by congressional act. So be amazed when you find some of these things. There's lots of good stuff going on. So I'm going to stop the share for now and ask if there are questions. I'm going to see if I can get you unmuted. That's always an adventure. Or you can unmute yourself if you choose to. Unmute yourself now if you choose to, and ask any questions you might want to ask.
I'm going to say, wow.
Thank you, Jan.
Oh my gosh.
This is Phil. Are
Yep.
you done?
Go ahead.
This is Phil Brooks, and I just wanted to ask if you're familiar with the term Kincaid as part of homesteading, because my grandfather in Nebraska homesteaded through an amendment to the Homestead Act that allowed him to get a full section, or 640 acres. This was in 1915. So
yeah, that's Phil. I'm not familiar with the term Kincaid, but I'm going to tell you that each state managed to get exceptions. Many of the states did exceptions, and then they were able to grant state land or grant it under the aegis of state land. And so it could be one of those, or it could be a situation where the land in the first place was very poor. And they found out that, for example, you could only range 2 units, meaning a cow and a calf or whatever on, like 30 acres. And so more land was given. But I'm not familiar with that Kincaid thing precisely. I have a suspicion, though, that that's what it was, Phil.
Yeah, and I do know that they went for more territory because you could not support uh, uh, a ranching operation on 160 acres.
Yeah,
This was in western Nebraska, which
yeah.
is it, more like eastern Montana in
Yep,
terms of
sand hills
rainfall.
and whatever. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
exactly. And one more detail. I've read that it was named after a U.S. senator whose surname was Kincaid
Oh,
that got this set up. But that's all I know.
yeah. Frequently, a lot of those pieces of legislation then were named for the people who asked for it or the special exception or whatever. So
Yeah.
that's a pretty neat thing to tell us, Phil. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Other things, anyone?